We are here to talk about all things emulation with you, Russ. And I suppose Mark is going to kick us off here. We have some some points, some questions to lead us in our chat about it all. Mark, you kind of lead things here, and myself and Jack will chip in.
Definitely,
So.
yeah. I mean, like, so you touched on this earlier about how you got started with the scene and like over the course of the pandemic, but like before that, where did the kind of interest in the I guess, retro emulation, like, were you interested in emulation and retro games before that? Like, because I've had, emulation and ROMs on my PCs going back for years and stuff. Like, was you following the scene in that regards before you got into the devices as well?
Yeah, a little bit. I just, when I could. So, for example, I definitely had hacked my Wii, for example, probably sometime in the late 2000s, so 2009 or so. So I had done that, and I kind of put ROMs on there and stuff like that. And then a little bit I'm a Mac user, and so there wasn't a lot of options for a long time. But then like OpenEmu came out, which was really helpful. But yeah, not a lot, like not to the point where I was I would call myself a retro gamer or something like that, but it was just something, every few years I would get the itch, and I would go and scratch it. And, the NES Classic, when that little mini console came out, things like that. I've always been drawn to the 8-bit and 16-bit era systems because that's mainly what I, grew up, in the 80s. So a lot of NES, and then we moved over to Sega Genesis. But then, as I got into high school, sports and girls took over. And so there's a huge gap for me when it comes to video games. And so like PS1 all the way up through like the second half of PS2 didn't play a thing, And so so that's never really kind of resonated with me. It's always been kind of the older stuff. And so, yeah, every once in a while I would just tinker and kind of pull up, what I could at the time. But once I saw those dedicated handhelds, that really kind of changed things for me.
How did you find out about the dedicated handhelds? Because I'm trying to think to myself now where I discovered them, and I can't for the life of me remember. I'm feeling it was just like the algorithm on YouTube one day went, hey, here's a thing that you might be interested in.
Yeah.
But like for you, where did was you just on Alibaba and just one day came across a device? Like, how was it for you?
So I used to use like RSS feeds for blogs and stuff. So I'd follow, I had like a tech section. I'd follow like things like, Engadget and The Verge and stuff like that. And I was kind of just following, just general tech trends, mostly like Apple products or whatever it happened to be. And they, one of them did some sort of article about, hey, here's this emulation handheld thing. And so I found a YouTube video, and it was the original Pocket Go, which is a really kind of bare bones. It's actually the same company that made the Miu, but this is several years ago. And so they had a Pocket Go V1. And so I ordered one of them, and this was probably 2019 or so. And so I ordered one, I got it in the mail, and hated it. Like, I didn't really enjoy it at all. But that's like kind of the start of it. And then in 2020, I got to the point where I was like, has it gotten any better? And so that's when I started looking like directly, like Google searching for retro handhelds. And that's when it started the whole Ambernic thing, because I found one of their devices.
Yeah, like, because I know one of the things with me, I think I was looking from the outside in for about a year or so before I took the plunge, because partially a lot of times when I'd kind of read up about like the reviews of devices, a lot of the similarities were, hey, it's hard to get this thing set up. Once you're going, you're good, but like getting RetroArch or whatever running it's kind of a pain. And like one of the things that got me on board of it, like my first one was the Retroid Pocket 2+2, was the fact that this was a pretty affordable device, and it was running up to like Dreamcast, GameCube to some degree, but also the fact that you had put out like a really kind of comprehensive guide on how to get these things running. And like when it came to you figuring out how to kind of set these up, was there like just a lot of trial and error, like a lot of hours spent figuring it out? Like how much kind of resources were out there before you started putting these videos out? And we've seen other people kind of doing it since, but like kind of in the early days, if you will, like what resources were there to work with, or was it just you kind of brute force and trial and error until something was running?
it was one of those things where there were just a bunch of collection of websites out there. You know, some guy would put up a repository, or someone would make like one Reddit post and be like, here you go, the ultimate guide or whatever. And it was never complete, you know. And so there were things out there, you know, but a lot of them were written by the developers themselves, who are not good at writing tutorials, right?
Yeah.
And so, there was a lot of information out there, but nothing comprehensive. And, you know, when something would change, there would be an update to the emulator or whatever. Sometimes there wasn't good documentation to say, hey, this has been fixed or whatever. And so, I spent probably 2.5, 3 months on my first device was the RG350. 2.5, 3 months on it, just playing it before I even started writing a guide for it, because it took me that long to figure out, you know, the whole Linux-based operating systems, how that all worked, and how to make it look pretty and work and all that kind of stuff. So definitely a lot of time invested in that first end. But I remember there was a point where I thought to myself, man, I could do anything. Like, I now can do everything basically with this device. Anything that you can do on it, I've now figured out how to do. And that's kind of when I started writing the guides.
But if 2-3 months was your original kind of lead-in time to figure things out, you know, now that you're kind of you're up and you're running and you're more familiar in the space, from the moment where you get your hands on a device to the moment you kind of put the video out there, how long is the tutorial for a particular device taking you nowadays, from conception to publishing?
It's still a few months. A lot of that has to do with, I'll do a review first, right? And that usually take me a bit of time. I actually get to the point sometimes where I have to do a preliminary review. I'm like, okay, here's how it stands right now, but this isn't my final review, because I'm waiting on custom firmware or whatever it is to kind of catch up. And so I usually do wait a few months before I release a starter guide. A good example of that is there's a console that came out around the beginning of the year called the Odin, and I got that right at the beginning of the year, but I did not release my starter guide until May, because it took 5 months for me to kind of wrap my head around it, wait for things to kind of settle out in terms of development and things like that, and then I'm like, okay, now's the time to jump in and give that guide. So it does still take some months.
You're still waiting to get yours.
Yeah,
I think I ordered mine, I want to say like late February, and
man.
Yeah, I know. There's been issues with that, and I feel like he's focusing more on like the light model at the moment. And then I know there was the was it the AN is the
AYN is the company.
Version. Yeah, it's kind of all kind of crazy at the moment. So that company itself, they were just kind of a scrappy startup, and then they got a lot of attention, you know, just based on some key YouTube videos, and you know, they sent their review devices to major outlets. Like, I didn't even get one; I had to order one and wait for it to come or whatever. But they sent it to places like The Verge and Linus and things like that, and so a lot of exposure and a lot of people, you know, pitching in to buy and pre-order one, and they're just overwhelmed. And then in the middle of it, last month, they introduced 5 new models that they're planning on shipping at the end of the year. It isn't going to happen, but
when I see stuff in 2022, like Microsoft can't get controllers out to almost the entirety of Europe at the moment,
right?
Like, I have no trouble understanding how much pressure smaller startups or companies how much pressure they must be under to get their products out. It must be a real struggle.
Yeah, it's one of those things too. I've always I like being on the outsider kind of perspective. Like, I don't want to be the guy who's talking to the companies, who is, you know, actually influencing what they're choosing to make as far as business decisions. Like, I don't want to be part of that. I just send me the product when it's done, and then let me play around with it. Like, and let me do that part of it. You know, the front end part of it. You know, getting things launched and being like the hype guy or whatever. Not interested. You know, just send it to me when it's ready.
How have you found, like, you know, you said you started the channel around about the time of the start of the pandemic, if I recall. How have you found, in terms of like just the way the community has grown over those years, but also just like, you know, are there kind of like common questions or common things that you find the community that are asking you, or like I'm on your Discord channel, and like that's just incredible. Like in terms of the resources that are there, and the people that are on there to, you know, if I need to find out something about like the Mayu Mini, for example, I can go into that channel and get like kind of help and stuff. But sort of earlier on, like maybe pre-Discord, were there kind of like common questions that people would ask you, or just kind of issues that they were having that they needed help with?
Yeah, you know, a lot of it was you know, I don't know best word for it, but like normies, like people who don't know anything about this stuff, but they ran across a video and ordered it, and now they're like, you know, what is a firmware, you know, that kind of thing. And so number one question I get all the time is, where are the games? Like, how can I find the games, right? And so obviously I don't even touch that subject or anything else like that. But then, yeah, the other...
What's a BIOS?
Right, exactly. And so I try to really kind of delineate that in each of my guides. It's just like, hey, these are these two things. This is what they mean. They can mean more about it. And, you know, there's that kind of element to it. It's funny, you see trends, especially for me. I get, you know, even though I've actually removed my email address from like most of my website stuff because I was just getting so many, you know, I still get probably half a dozen emails a day. And I watch these trends, and some of them are really fascinating. For example, number one, when someone buys a device and, you know, they're expecting it to be preloaded with games, they don't know anything about that, and they don't want to learn any of that. They just want to play the game. 9 times out of 10, what they want to play are WWF games, like wrestling games.
Really?
I don't know why, but that's the target audience. It's like these wrestling guys, and it's like, yeah, I just want to play Def Jam, or I want to play WWF. I don't want to learn anything else. I just want to play those games. And I'm like, man, are you guys talking to each other? Like, how does this happen? So,
that's fascinating.
Yeah. I suppose, like, we're kind of hitting upon it there with the, you know, the people having kind of really niche demands, and, you know, Mark was mentioning your Discord and stuff like that. Like, emulation within video games, it's just like a niche within a niche. Do you find, like, on the whole, as a very visible person in that community, that, like, people within emulation circles are they friendlier and more collaborative than in other kind of broader gaming spaces, or are they kind of like that bit more kind of pedantic and frustrated when things aren't working the way they goddamn want them to?
Yeah, there's a big spectrum, right? Like, so, like the guys at the top, the ones who have been doing emulation for 15 years and stuff, they know all about like integer scaling and then pixel, you know, smushing and all that other kind of stuff, way beyond anything that I understand, and I'm kind of learning as I go, you know. So those guys tend to be really helpful. The thing is, a lot of them have the knowledge and won't share it. You know, that's always been the biggest thing. It's like, you've got these keys to unlock like this perfect emulation experience, and I had to figure it out because you never wrote it down, you know. And so there's like kind of that element to it. And yeah, the vast majority though is below that kind of surface level. Like, even, you know, Mark, you being on the Discord is you're in that top 5%, you know what I mean? Like, there's not a lot of people in those Discord servers compared to the just kind of the average Joes who are just kind of looking into just playing Mario, you know. And so big spectrum change there. At that lower end, I think that, you know, those are actually the people I try to speak to the most when I make a video, because I'm still in that group too. I get genuine joy when I can play Mario 2 on anything. Like, it's just amazing to me. I'm like, oh my God, this is magic all over again, you know? And so I kind of try to appeal to that. If I was to try to appeal to that top 1% of those emulation guys who've been doing it forever, it's a losing battle at that point. You know, they're all entrenched in Linux versus Android versus whatever, you know? I don't want to do any of that stuff. I just want to play Mario.
Yeah, most people are just like, hey, I just want to play wrestling games. I don't care about like what platform I'm playing it on. Right. I will say, I think one of the things is we're seeing, or I'm seeing at least, like those keys or those gates are being opened in a way where, you know, like for me with my Mario Mini, like there's a guy, Retro Breeze, who's just doing guides specific for that device. It's like, hey, if you want to learn how to get like Sega CD games running, hey, here's a 5-minute video. If you want to like know how to just install Onion OS, boom, here's the video for it. So, you know, not only are we now seeing like just reviews of devices and whatnot, and not only are we just seeing, I mean, you're doing like these kind of full comprehensive like breakdowns of how to get like everything running, right? But, you know, like a channel like that is now just doing these kind of quick 5-minute videos, which are perfect for just like, hey, I have like this specific emulator, I have no idea how to get us set up, boom, here's a channel that's just doing those devices specifically. I've not done a lot of research to kind of see if there are like other devices and other channels doing that kind of thing, but I have to imagine over time that's gonna, you know, start happening.
Absolutely. And that's how my thing was, I was only going to make guides on the RG350, the first device that I had, the one that I'd spent all those months on. That was it. Like, I made dedicated videos, spent like a week working on, for example, I figured out how to import the audio tracks, like the voice tracks from the first 2 Monkey Island games into ScumVM to play on the RG350 so that you could play those original 2 games with the voice tracks as well from the special editions. And so I spent a week doing that, you know what I mean? And that got like 50 views. Nobody really cared, you know what I mean? But
think how much Horizon you could have played in that time.
Right, exactly. But like the niche of the niche, like that's how I actually started. And then just over time, it just kind of expanded. I wasn't, I got my first Retroid Pocket 2 and I was like, okay, I'll do a review of this. And then all of a sudden that got a lot of views. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess people like the way I review things. And so it just kind of blossomed. But yeah, I have a running list of like all the videos I want to work on, and there's hundreds, and many of them are those little things that like Retro Breeze is doing with the Miu Mini, where he's just like, hey, here's how to do one thing. And so actually he inspired me to make a video a few weeks ago where it was how to make a custom boot logo for your Miu Mini. And he made a video on it already, but I was like, well, I'm going to add to it. I'm also going to show you how to make your own in Photoshop and then get it added as well, as opposed to just using the ones that were pre-installed. And so it's funny because no one really cared about that video because it was a niche of a niche, when all of a sudden my audience is more into the whole general expansion comprehensive guide thing. So kind of interesting.
And I suppose, with your channel, you will kind of get a mix of viewers between those kind of like hardcore, emulation is our bread and butter, and then a lot of the people who were, I think I can speak on behalf of the 3 of us, that found your channel because we were just like, we bought this Retroid Pocket and it's like, fucking help, we don't know what we're doing. So how does that factor into your consideration in how you put your videos together? How do you kind of skew it towards both levels of knowledge and interest in the field?
Yeah, it's hard. I've had to really be to wear several hats. I've learned that over time. I can be that hardware reviewer too, but that comprehensive guide thing is still that bread and butter, because not a lot of people want to devote the time to make that video. And I get it. You know what I mean? It's rough. It's so hard that often I have to split it into 2 videos because it's so long, and that's just a big undertaking. It takes me, 2 weeks to make one of those videos typically. And so, yeah, it's wearing a couple hats, and trying to figure out what resonates most with people. To be honest, I follow the trends of what people ask of me. And so I will look on Reddit, I'll look on my comments under my YouTube videos, and then all the emails I get and say, okay, trending right now is that people really, everyone's starting to get their Odin, so they need to have a starter guide. I haven't made, for example, a Steam Deck starter guide, even though I've had a Steam Deck for several months, because not enough people have it to kind of flip over to have that amount of time necessary to devote to it. But that's coming. It's on my list, and pretty high up is that next step is to do the Steam Deck starter guide.
That brings me actually to my next question. I was going to make a hard pivot left, but you've kind of brought it on. So where, with the Steam Deck, where do you think that sits in kind of the grander scheme of the emulation scene and what is possible with the Steam Deck? Because one of the things that I think we've seen over the past 6 months or so is a lot of these companies are now just throwing out these kind of big budget handheld devices that are they're not so much focused on the retro emulation. They can obviously still do that, but hey, you can play your current games on these things as well. And it seems like there's a new one coming out every week, on top of there seems to be a new Ambernic device every week as well. So
right.
Do you think a lot of that is in response to the Steam Deck, or is it just where that market is currently, and where do you think just the Steam Deck kind of sits and everything? And obviously you have one and had it for a couple of months, and everyone I've heard that has one is greatly enjoying it and is making me want to get one. So yeah.
So I'll start with, so Ambernic in particular, right? They've been doing all these Linux-based devices, and then they did a couple Android ones, and then now they've released a Windows-based one. And I do think that the retro handheld devices will eventually just kind of go in that direction, mostly because it is saving them a lot of money to not have to do the software development, right? If they can just throw Android on it, or they can just throw Windows on it, then all of a sudden they no longer have to make a custom firmware for that specific device, which is what they were trying to do before. And it was always garbage, and they were stealing it from open source developers, and then they would slap all their games on it, totally illegal and all that kind of stuff. And it was also souring the community, like the development community. It's like, I don't want to work on this thing because they stole my code or whatever it happens to be. With Windows, it's much easier. You know, it's just like, okay, well, they installed Windows on it, everyone else can figure out the rest. And so in that sense, I do think that over time we are going to start seeing more of a move towards those operating systems. I'm all for it. You know, I do really love the custom Linux operating systems, but they are kind of hard to work. But on the bright side, there are some, as you start getting to that higher power tier, things like Batacera, which will run on a Windows-based device through a USB drive or an SD card or whatever. Those are already set up in open source, and so it just kind of makes things a little bit easier. So I see that trend happening where they're going to get like those higher-end handhelds and things like that too. But there's still it's going to be a gap for the low-end stuff too. The Mio Mini, I think, is a perfect example where it's like, you know, they've slapped on a custom firmware operating system for that, or their own firmware, and then, you know, they didn't even make it open source, but enough people loved it so much they figured out how to kind of crack the code on it and make the launchers a little bit better and things like that. And so there's still going to be a gap for that small pick up and play device, but absolutely the trend is going to go towards the bigger stuff. And the Steam Deck was a huge influence on that. I think once people realized they could have like a handheld device like that, it's pretty awesome. I think the Steam Deck is a flawed device, and just the size of it is very big. It's not like a just a pick up and play portable kind of device the way that I wish it was. And as the devices start getting smaller, which is going to happen over the next couple of years, we're going to really hit a sweet spot, I think, and it'll be pretty interesting.
In terms of your process for making videos, I know you said earlier that you were kind of a written guides guy first, and then kind of you started pivoting into video. When you put them together now, do you script a video from which then you pull the salient details to put into a written guide later, or do you still kind of come from the mindset of I'm a written guides guy and then I will develop this written guide later into a video guide?
So always write the written guide first. Like I've got to, you know, that's basically my script when I make the video, you know. So I'm like, okay, what are all the things I need to know about how to work this device? Okay. And, you know, getting it started, or what accessories do I need? You know, what do I need to install and all that kind of stuff. So I do the written guide first, and then start filming the video. And then often what will come back is I'll find things as I'm filming. I'm like, oh, I forgot to add this. And so I'll go back and do that. But yeah, I publish them both at the exact same moment typically. But the written guide definitely is the thing I start on first, just because it allows me to kind of get my thoughts out first. Otherwise, I would be just wasting film footage as I'm trying to figure it out on camera.
For when you see kind of new people coming to emulation, you know, in the comments or in your emails or whatever, are there any common kind of big mistakes you see people making from the start when they kind of jump headlong into this stuff that they should be avoiding, or that you're kind of you're surprised are still big mistakes people make now?
Yeah, number one is that people will go to shady websites to download their ROM files. You know, they're just Googling whatever and then picking up the first one. And often those files are they're old, or there's just something wrong with the checksum on them. And so it comes to the point where they're having issues, and it's obviously the ROM file. And I'm not going to say, well, you need to go to this website instead, or whatever it happens to be, you know. Yeah. And so that's probably number one common issue. And then the other one is just the difference between moving a file over and then flashing an SD card, and then like doing things like partitioning and things like that. It's just a little bit too much for a normal user to kind of wrap their head around. And so I get that often too. It's like, hey, you know, I dragged this file into my SD card, but it's not working. I was like, well, yeah, you got to use a flashing firmware to actually flash it so that it's a bootable SD card. And that's another really common issue.
Yeah, I gotta say as well, like from the the point about the dodgy websites and things like that, that your guide on the Retroid Pocket 2, when we all got that, just even your list of just flashing up on the screen, these are the file extension types you need for each platform that are going to work, really helped me anyway sort the wheat from the chaff, as like what is the file I should be looking to download versus what is probably a pile of crap.
Right.
That was really, really helpful. Do you think there are, for people who are still outside observers of emulation who don't really know a lot about it, are there big misconceptions about it that you've seen out there?
Yeah, so probably the biggest is just the whole like piracy thing and everything else. It's hard, you're never going to convince anybody one way or the other, but for me, I'm a big fair use kind of guy. So I think that if you own the original cartridge or whatever, even if you're not dumping it yourself, which I have a video on how to do that as well, which nobody watches, but I have those videos out there. There's some legal precedents in other forms of media, when it comes to DVDs or, music files and things like that, yeah, once you have purchased that medium, then it doesn't matter what medium you put it on afterwards, it's still yours. It's like ripping a CD and putting it into MP3 and putting it on your iPod, that whole kind of concept. And so I get it. There's a lot of people who have feelings one way or another. They think that you absolutely should pirate and then stick it to Nintendo or whatever. And then there's others, it's like, no, you need to rebuy it based on Nintendo's own policies, which are not necessarily set in legal precedents either. And so yeah, it's rough.
I mean, I feel like it's something over time where we see more incidents like, God, what game was it this week that they announced that, I think it may have actually been Assassin's Creed. I can't remember which one, but basically they announced they were going to be shutting off like certain services or certain parts of the game and like the DLC and that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I think as you get more of those types of incidents happen, or you have stuff like with, the Wii and the 3DS and closing those shops for a while and, they're back up now. And, there's that kind of whole thing about the preservation of games and that, hey, if you have just a digital only game that is only available somewhere, and then at some point that game gets switched off and there's no other way to download it again. Hi, PT. Emulation does become critical at that point, and I think that's always going to be like the big no, this is why this is here. Yes, obviously you do have people that don't buy games, and this is the way that they play games, and look, they're always going to do that. They're just not going to buy games. Even if you take it away, they're probably just not going to buy games. So I do think that, emulation, just in terms of preservation, if nothing else, is highly essential as we get more into a digital space within video games.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. And when I made that video, I had this little device that would like rip your cartridges and stuff. There was something to be said about the moment when I took Mario 3, put it in that device, pulled out the ROM file, and then loaded it up onto my device. You can get Mario 3 anywhere, right? But playing my Mario 3 from my childhood, there's no difference between the ones and zeros between that and anything else. But man, it felt like it, And so I can totally see that preservation thing. What if there is some game out there that totally isn't preserved? And you'll see graphs. There are some, preservation societies that kind of like work through preserving an entire catalog, and they're not as comprehensive as you would think they would be. A Game Boy Advance catalog is something like only 40% preserved at this point. It's like there's still some missing data out there. So it's crazy.
It's always been weird to me that more so than pretty much any other field of entertainment or pop culture that I can think of, that video games, and maybe it's because they're a newer field of entertainment than like cinema or anything like that, maybe that's part of it, that there's some kind of weird combination of carelessness, complacency, or just general being weird, Nintendo, about their legacy, and as you've both been saying, that preservation element, and it just, like, as somebody who studied history in college, it drives me completely fucking insane. Whatever about the Nintendo's weird thing of just, hey, every 3 to 4 years we're going to make you pay money for the same games you already had. That's Nintendo are off in their own world on that. But yeah, I suppose I get more and more concerned as time goes on about the that preservation aspect, and not just kind of those couple of examples you gave, Mark, but do you remember, was it towards the end of the PS3 generation when randomly all the licensed Marvel games were pulled off the store with no notice whatsoever? Sure. You couldn't even do the trick like you can do with PT to still download that to this day, or stuff like if you're really into your authentic experience when music licenses expire. For example, when Vice City was re-released on last gen, even before the horrendous HD polishes that came out more recently, a bunch of songs that expired and were pulled off the game. So without the work of people who are making physical collections or people who are emulating, we literally wouldn't have these things anymore.
Right. Yeah. And that's the point of us playing these games, is to recreate those moments in time, and so it just sucks when something's gone.
Yeah. 100%.
Do you have what's you got, like a kind of collection of personal favorite emulation devices at this moment, or what are the ones that you kind of come back to that you continue to play on?
Yeah, so I got a lot, Looking over here, I've got, almost 100 at this point. So wow. Major, like I used for a long time a small device called the RG280V. And so it's got a 2.8 inch screen, just a smaller little handheld that plays up to PS1. That's now effectively been replaced by the Miyoo Mini. Like that now is like absolutely an essential for me, because it's so pocketable. I can take it wherever, I have one sitting on my nightstand. Like that's an essential for me. And then there's another device that Ambernick made called the RG552, and this came out around December of last year. Expensive. This thing's $225 US, which is a lot for what it can do, because really it can only really do PS1 and below very, very well. It can do some others fairly well, but the thing about it is that it has this screen which has an aspect ratio that works for both like old school 4:3 content as well as wider content as well. And so it's just kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to really good pixel density. It's got a high resolution too, like higher than 1080p. And so because of that, it's just, all the games look gorgeous on it. So if I was to play an NES game or a Super Nintendo game or whatever, and size wasn't a factor, like that's the one I would pick. It's expensive and all the other kind of stuff, but that's still, and I plan on making a video here pretty soon, just kind of saying, hey, everyone gives it crap because it's $225, but I gotta say, like, when I play that, it's a tier above, like I play Mario 3 on that, it's a tier above any other system. And to me, that's worth that extra money. You know what I mean? Like what we're doing here is just throwing down cash to be able to recreate our childhoods in like a better way. And that one just hits it out of the park. But yeah, so those two are like my main ones. But yeah, I'll grab the Steam Deck. I've got a couple other ones like the Odin, which I'll grab every once in a while as well. But it's really those two that just kind of resonate the most with me.
I suppose you talked about your preference being to the 8 and 16-bit eras, but in your kind of like vast experience in emulation, is there a particular console or even generation of consoles that is still to you hilariously inconsistent in how well those games emulate? I know you would see stories pop up in major outlets about like, we finally got, this emulation community finally got, a particular GameCube game to stop being completely on fire or something like that. Is there a particular console where anytime you see like a ROM pop up, you're like, oh, well, let's see if this actually works this time?
Yeah. Original Xbox is like still notoriously bad when it comes to accuracy. And so like, you just can't play Jade Empire. Like you can't emulate it because there's just all these factors that go into it and stuff like that. And it doesn't get a lot of love, that emulator in particular, mostly because a lot of those games have been re-released by Microsoft in some other way, right? And so sure, I can't emulate Jade Empire, but man, I can play it anywhere, like it's one of those things where the original Xbox, yes, definitely pretty bad at that, especially in comparison to the same generation, GameCube and PS2, a lot more accurate kind of emulation. PS2 definitely harder to emulate than GameCube, but still ways better than Xbox. That one's just really hard to accurately emulate. And then there's others where people just haven't touched it. There's no viable like PS Vita emulator, for example. You can't play a PS Vita game on your PC. And so those kind of things is just a matter of what kind of attention it's been getting. Sega Saturn used to be like that. Traditionally, that was one that's just so hard to emulate. But they've kind of cracked that over the years. And so that's one that is pretty accurate to emulate. It just takes a lot of horsepower.
I would imagine
I feel like it's in keeping with the general level of attention the Vita got. That even in the emulation community, they're like, you know what? The hell with that.
I imagine like the big golden carrot, the next big thing will be the PlayStation 3, just because of how much of a colossal fuck up Sony has it on their hands in terms of, because they can't even get, like those games being emulated correctly. So I feel like, there is some stuff out there, but it's obviously it's such kind of the early days yet. And again, like the horsepower to get PS3 games emulate correctly, like I feel we're some ways off, but I feel like that's the big kind of next golden carrot, just because of the kind of, unless you have an actual PlayStation 3, you're just, playing these games through the cloud on Sony, and that's not the ideal way.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely one of those things where I don't see that same desire on the Xbox 360 side, because the backwards compatibility is pretty great for that compared to the PS3. But yeah, there's definitely some PS3 exclusives that I'd love to play at some point, Heavenly Sword or whatever it happens to be. You just can't really play it anywhere else. Thankfully, like Uncharted games got remastered or whatever. But all the same, I think that I agree. PS3 is a good emulation platform to kind of focus on in the future. It does require lots of cores, lots of threads to really get that running accurately on a PC. So in terms of playing it on handheld, we're still a few years out from that. But I think that's the next big one.
And I think we mentioned it here, and I know I think it was Nextlander were talking about it as well, and that just with those PS3 games, it is a case of like you're more likely you're going to see these remasters and remakes. That's probably what's going to happen more so than the whole backwards compatibility thing. And I think we talk about this in terms of Microsoft, but I still think that they don't get championed enough for how well of a job they've done in terms of backwards compatibility, and just how accessible so much stuff is on Game Pass, and there's still more stuff to come, and then again it makes me want to scream at Nintendo that much more with their kind of drip feed approach that hey, look, I'm still giving them money every month, so I guess I can't complain too much.
Yeah, I the Wii era, with the virtual console, oh my gosh, the amount of money that I gave Nintendo at that point to replay whatever, they're like $5 a pop, for an NES game, and man, I went hand over foot just paying every single thing. And so that was like my learning moment. Or like, what, I've now paid for these games twice over because I had them as the original cartridges, and now I've paid for them again. I don't know if I want to do this whole virtual console thing again. So
yeah. It is truly exhausting. I'm out anyway. That's all the big questions I had.
Yeah, I guess the one kind of big question, and I kind of brought this up earlier, but like with so many devices coming out at the moment, like do you worry that there's this kind of bubble where, I'm not expecting a 1985 video game crash or anything, but like do you feel there's a moment where we've got so many kind of devices coming out and maybe the demand isn't there, that like you kind of worry that at some point this whole thing is just going to kind of collapse under itself?
Yeah, so the Windows handheld PC thing is going to implode sometime next year. We've got big companies like AYN, the guys that made the Odin. They have like 5 or 6 different, like they're calling them the Loki, and that's these Windows handles. They have 5 or 6 different models of different chips and different sizes or whatever it happens to be. That's just one company. Like, that's exhausting already. And then you think about, there's another one called Aya Neo. They're releasing 6 or 7, I think even maybe 8 different models in the next year. There's one Explorer, and then obviously Valve with the Steam Deck. And then there's some others who are pitching, Ambernic has already released their own Windows device. These are very expensive devices to create and manufacture and everything else. And then on top of that, like, it's just too much choice. There's going to come to a point, I think they're all thinking, well, we're going to get this huge market share, but there's too many devices that there's not going to be a market share for each of them. They're all going to get this tiny piece of the pie after investing all this money. Something's going to blow back on them. I'm hoping that they've got the money to be able to withstand the fact that if they manufacture 2,000 of these devices, but only sell 200 of them because there's just too much choice out there that they can survive that, because they're going to have some issues in the future. And it's just unfortunate, but, you know, like, I think that each company is trying to be Apple. You know, the way I think about it, you know, Apple's got this whole lineup of devices. You know, we've got our MacBook Pro and our Mac Mini and all these little things that kind of fulfill every niche. And so if you just want to be an Apple person, you can. But you have 4 different companies trying to do the same thing in the same space. It's just not really going to work. And so my worry is when it comes to those expensive ones, there's going to be some pushback at some point where people aren't going to buy as many as they are expecting, because they're heavier investments for the actual consumer. You know, they're only going to buy one and they don't know which one to buy. And so that's going to kind of be a big issue coming in the future. And then, yeah, I just don't know if all the companies will be able to survive that. And so, yeah, we'll see. I mostly try to focus on the lower end and cheaper devices, because I just think that that's a more appealing thing, because, you know, it's a impulse buy. You know, when you're at $100 or less, you know, it's just something you're like, hey, you know, I can buy this thing. You know,
Yeah.
I remember paying $60 for Golden Axe on the Sega Genesis, you know, back in the day. And now I can say, well, for a little bit more than that, you know, the Miu Mini price is $60, right? So let's say $65 for a Miu Mini with shipping and everything. And I can get Golden Axe plus all the other Genesis games on the same thing. Like, it's just kind of an amazing sell. But when you start saying, oh yeah, here's a $700 handheld that can play your Windows games and stuff, it's like, I don't know, my computer can already do that.